have with me today Dr. Forrest Inslee, and my name is Derek McNeil, and I'm the academic dean here at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. Forrest, Dr. Inslee works at Northwest University in Kirkland, Washington, but Forrest also works with us. Forrest is an ethnographer, and we have played with this notion of text, soul, and culture, and the necessity of thinking about and talking about culture in a context that usually talks about text and soul. And that cultural piece feels very important to the model that we've established and developed, but actually harder for us to do. And so Forrest has been very helpful, helping us think through culture and how to study culture and how to study people groups. Forrest, one of the things I hear, you are a full professor at Northwest and also the chair of the Global Studies program. Mm-hmm. And love to hear a little bit about how you think about ethnography and the work. And even for many of us, I think we have a confusion about what's anthropology versus ethnography. Mm-hmm. Maybe share a little bit about that with us.
Well, I'll start with why I don't call myself really an anthropologist. Mm-hmm. Even though ethnography is kind of a subset of anthropology. Ethnography really, if you break the word down, is writing culture. And it is all about trying to look at cultural context. It's a lot more than writing, of course. Mm-hmm. There are videographers and photographers and ethnomusicologists. So really, in the realm of culture, everything is fair game for the ethnographer. But really, the focus is on living culture. Mm. You know, what is going on with particular people and place in a given time. That's what ethnographers most care about. And because ethnographers are primarily focused on meaning, that kind of puts them at odds in some ways with the rest of anthropology, which is a lot more about description and categorization and sort of systemic understanding. And that's all true of ethnography, but ethnography is primarily about really looking at culture as text and trying to look really at how culture can be explicated or interpreted in terms of the meanings that lie below the surface. Mm-hmm. So as an ethnographer, I wasn't trained in anthropology. My university had an anthropology department, and I took classes in it, but my main training came from a school of communication at Northwestern University, and a lot of my theoretical underpinning from my field came from the field of theater and literary interpretation. So we really look at culture as text to try to understand, really almost from an aesthetic point of view, what's going on in a given place and time.
Maybe I'll ask you to talk a little bit more about that. And talk about early influences that shaped your interest in ethnography and drew you to this field.
Sure. Well, probably the earliest interest is actually from my grandma, who was a kind of quintessential storyteller, and she had kind of fixated on those parts of our family that had native ancestry that was rooted in the Pacific Northwest, because my family goes back quite a ways generationally here in Washington State. So she would tell us stories all the time, and she would focus on the stories that, talked about those components of our family identity that were, I guess, more unique and more interesting. And so, and who knows, a lot of it is just stories, it's hard to say what's true and not true, but it was those stories, and it was her tying culture to identity that, for me, kind of lit the fire. And mostly it was about the stories that rooted us to place. I mean, my family, part of my family came from Tennessee on covered wagons, right? And made that journey and came through Eastern Washington and ended up over here. But it's those stories which make me feel like I belong here, sort of in a sort of deep existential way, that that I've been here long enough where I feel like my soul is rooted here in some ways. And that just felt really important to me, even as a kid, you know. Mm-hmm. So I think it was those stories which led me then to really become an English major is what I loved most.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was an English major, but then did a minor in anthropology because I was still really intrigued with culture. And so after I finished my undergrad degree in English, decided to try to get back to the anthropology part. The anthropology department was just a bit dry and didactic for my tastes, and I actually met this guy named Dwight Conkergood in the School of Communication, and his thing was the ethnography of performance, which, you know, as a title kind of put me off from the get-go. It sounded a little airy-fairy. But, you know, as I got to know him and as he explained his work, I thought, no, this is exactly what I'm made for. Because in some ways it draws on my familiarity and love of English literary theory, but in a way that applies it to living cultures as texts. He did a number of things which I just found really fascinating. He looked at, he worked in Thai refugee camps at one point and was trying to solve a problem that the doctors and nurses from Western nations were trying to solve, in that the Hmong people in these refugee camps were very resistant to Western health practices and medical care. Mm-hmm. And it was quite a battle. And what he did with ethnography was go into the situation, take the time to learn about the situation, take the time to learn about what it was that was making the people afraid, right, of doctors. To learn, maybe more importantly, what was going on in culture that represented resources that could be used to solve the problem. And maybe most importantly, he really helped the Hmong people as an advocate and champion to, first of all, recognize the issues they were facing in terms of healthcare, for example, and then to be their own solution. Mm-hmm. So his emphasis is, let's find out what's good and beautiful here in this place and time and people. And then, it's his job as an ethnographer to help bring that to the fore, so that people understand that we have the solutions to our problems within us, within our own culture, that while the doctors, one of their mistakes was saying, you are backwards, your health practices are unsustainable and insufficient, let us show you how to be healthy. Let us show you how to be clean and to sort of do sanitation practices in this refugee camp. And that was just very demeaning to them. And it was one of the reasons they would flee from the doctors, is because it was essentially a dishonoring relationship. But as an ethnographer, Dwight's job was to help to understand what was happening at a socio-cultural level and help people to see what's really going on, and then help everyone to be part of the solution to the problem. So he was really my mentor and model. And so all the ethnography I've done since then, I constantly think back to, what would Dwight do in this particular situation? Because he, taught me not just the skills of ethnographic research, but more importantly, the characteristics of the ethnographic researcher, which are teachability and humility.
Well, it's interesting because I don't think I thought it was as much about story as you've just described.
Yes.
And I think I have thought about anthropology, not ethnography. I mean, it's been the dominant sort of frame. And that was about categorization, or at least about groups of people and understanding descriptive qualities of groups of people. But what you're describing is a great deal more meaningful and about stories.
Well, I think you're touching on kind of my life mission, which is in a lot of ways to take this sort of powerful, amazing approach to learning that is ethnography and apply it everywhere, right? I mean, where isn't ethnography relevant, right? I mean, if you're looking to understand context, ethnography helps you, whether you're a business person or an educator or theologian or anthropologist. I mean, for me at Northwest, my focus is on those people who, graduate students who want to really make a difference in terms of advocating for and working for social change, especially in cross-cultural contexts. So a lot of my students end up either working for nonprofits or starting their own nonprofits, and usually somewhere that isn't the U.S. But what I'm trying to help them to understand is that they can never go into a situation with the intent to be an agent of social change, assuming that they know the answers, which is so Western that we do that, right? We're trained in the West to think that way. It's like, you have the answers, you just need the strategies, you need to know the right formulas and policies and programs to apply, and then you can solve the problem. It's really hubristic, but it's our culture. So my job is to help people, I feel my mission really is to help people to become learners first, and not just to be humble as they enter into a situation, but to be active learners. So you need skills. How do you learn? What do you look for? Ethnography tells you how to look at things intentionally. Ethnography tells you how to talk to people in terms of interviewing people, for example. Ethnography tells you how to take that sort of raw data that you get from culture and to make sense of it. How do you codify it? How do you pull themes out of it? How do you take those themes and then make them operational, and to determine what are the actual implications of what you're learning. But it's all essentially a mindset more than anything else. You've got to be a learner, you've got to be humble, and you've got to understand that you are a co-researcher in the truest sense. Yeah, you've got a certain Western objective perspective, which will be part of the solution to a given social problem. But the people you're working with are their own solution as well. And at best, my students, I hope, will become catalysts for change, not imposers of change, right? And so really the job of a good community developer, which is my program, is to be that kind of catalyst for social change by starting with that place and attitude of active learning, and then the sort of mode of learning is ethnography in our case.
Exciting. One of the things, and your comment takes me two different directions. Let me see if I can settle down and only go with one. We have talked about in the past about church and wishing that some of the skill sets that you taught were a part of our thinking in terms of church communities, particularly in this moment we talk about being in a post-church period where things are shifting. Populations are less enthusiastic about what they're getting in a church context. It feels important to have additional sets of skills, and you've talked about wishing the church could be more excited about learning about its environment and the meaningful ways it impacts the communities that it's in. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I feel really dismayed these days with where the church is heading. I feel sad because I think day by day the church becomes less and less relevant, especially to younger generations. And I think that has accelerated in the last year, really, just in terms of the church, becoming calcified and solidified around certain positions, but maybe more importantly, around certain ways of being. This is what we stand for, this is who we are, this is how we practice, and that is a formula for institutional death and irrelevance. And so it really makes me sad because I love the church. I just have to say that I love the church. And so part of my frustration at the moment is feeling like while I get to work with students who are doing social change in various contexts, I'm not working with a lot of people who are engaged in making church, serving the church, working with the church. And so I feel like there's a bit of a wall of opportunity there that I'm wondering about, what my role is going to be in the future. But all to say that I think that, when you assume that there's only 4 or 5 church forms and that you just sort of plug and play, in a given context, wherever you are, just, depending on what feels instinctively right, that might work, but I don't think it's the best approach. I think church has to reflect place. Church has to reflect the people who make the church. I think Parish Collective does a pretty good job of living that truth. They understand that church has to be all about place and people. Each church has to be somewhat unique and sort of characteristic for that given place and time. But I guess I look at ethnography and I think, if pastors could be trained as ethnographers, then they would start in that place of listening rather than that place of, all right, what's in my toolbox that I'm going to actually use in this context? Instead, it's, what tools need to be invented, but maybe more importantly, I keep saying that phrase, what tools are represented here among the people in this community that are already here? What are the beautiful things about this community, about this place? What are the resources that we can, emphasize and highlight and bring to the foreground that could actually help us to make an expression of church which expresses the heart of the place and people. And I say people, but I also mean place. I think church has a lot to do with the spirit of place, and the history of place and the future of place. I think it's a holistic way of looking at a given setting or context, and then really using imaginative, creative skills to let something new emerge. And I think we're really after the new right now. Not to dissociate from the historical church. I think that's our sort of context and milieu, but I think every place and people shapes its expression of church. And to tie it back to ethnography, I think ethnography gives people the tools to understand what influences from context need to come into play. Does that make sense?
A sort of sensitivity to not just simply what we think the text is saying, but also what the context is shaping, and how the context is reshaping some of our pursuit and what we need to pursue in the text. So that tension, and it's interesting where I have been in other places where I'll say anthropology was in tension with theology. And we're really talking about ways for anthropology to help us understand the theological exercise, to understand what is God asking of us in this place, in this context with these people. That was just different. And some of the sort of caution, and this is, I've kind of grown up in cautious environments about anthropology for that reason. Somehow it took us away from God as opposed to really raise questions about what is God doing in this space and place with these people.
And as a student of anthropology in a secular context, I was really aware of those questions. There is a drive in anthropology, as there are in many social sciences, including psychology, to de-emphasize, say, spiritual dynamics and realities. And you wouldn't even hear that phrase, spiritual reality, right? Because it's already dismissed as a relevant factor or a real factor. But I would say that there are plenty of Christian anthropologists who would beg to differ. And I think that while this isn't any kind of subfield or anything, I think there is a spiritual anthropology. There's spiritual ethnography. When I teach students to figure out the ways they are going to listen to the spirit of place. And that it gets hard, it gets tricky. There's no real formulas for that, but there are people who understand that there's a spiritual dimension to reality that we, even as social scientists, maybe especially as social scientists, have to pay attention to. Ethnography makes a lot of room for that, actually, because again, as you point out, that our bread and butter is the stories of people, and spirituality is contained in stories. Theology is contained in stories, and ethnography really wants to hear those stories for that reason.
Well, one of the things that is I've heard your stories, and two things. This is the other part of the curiosity I had. You had spent a number of years in Turkey, and But I can also remember a story you talked about living for a couple months with homeless folk.
Mm-hmm.
What impressed me was the sort of incarnational aspects of both those things. And the desire or to see yourselves as not just simply examining people or observing them, but actually being with them so that the meaningfulness of their life makes sense within their context, not as something you've observed. And I don't know if either of those stories, and maybe we'll probably end on one of those stories, but maybe I'd love to hear a bit of what drew you to Turkey and the sense of calling and purpose that you felt going there.
Yeah. Initially, I went to Turkey on a church missions trip. One of my fellow students at Northwestern University was a Turk, and she knew a group of Turks who had been converted to Christianity, which really is an unusual thing. It was back then, especially. And they were actually trying to figure out how to be a church. They didn't know what it meant to create a church. And so they felt kind of alone. And so they had asked her to find someone in the States who would come teach them about church. So she approached our church and said, will you go? So we did. It was a really good trip in the sense that I really felt a connection. I was in the middle of a doctoral program, so wasn't really expecting that. But the connection was such that the leaders there asked me in particular to come back and live long term to continue to teach them about church. And I said yes, without really thinking much about it. I came back to the States, and seminary professor friends convinced me that if I were going to do that, I needed to finish my doctorate and then go to seminary. Because I said, if they're asking you how to be a church, you better know what you think about church, and you better have some theology of church, et cetera, et cetera. And they were right. And so I agreed to go back to Turkey on a yearly basis, teach classes, even as I prepared to move there. So finished my doctorate, went to Regent College in Vancouver. And while I was there, they let me do an ethnographic master's in theology. And so my whole program was oriented around, what would it look like to do theological education in a contextualized Turkish way. Because when I was going to Turkey, I taught for an underground Bible school that was led by a Canadian Baptist lady who was just, a hero of the faith and so faithful, but she was really building a Bible school based on very kind of old school Western conceptions. I mean, not even old school. I mean, it's the way we learn, classroom setting, top-down instruction, just a very Western approach that the more I taught in that context, the more I realized this is so not connecting, right? People are really bored. Turks are learning, but they're not learning knowledge that makes any difference. And my gosh, they live in a place where they need theological and biblical training that's going to make a difference. They're trying to build something that hasn't existed before. That is a sort of Turkish church. And so that was really my impulse, was sort of dissatisfaction with what I was helping to support. So Regent gave me permission to kind of rethink and dream. So I did a lot of ethnography on my visits to Turkey each time, and would ask questions, not direct questions like, what should we do to have a better theological education system, but more story-based questions like, tell me a story of the time when you learned something that changed your life, And then I would ask them, what was the nature of that experience? Like, tell me about it. Where were you? Who were you with? What did it feel like? Just doing ethnography around those times when people found themselves transformed, when they found themselves having their worldview changed, when they found themselves being challenged to put Jesus to the test of reality. And so, took all those conversations and all those observations of educational settings and brought them home, and Regent allowed me to create a design for a new theological program in Turkey, which is actually, they're using that today. They replaced the older Bible school approach. But, just as an example, I would ask people about the times when they felt like their view of the world shifted, or their view of Jesus shifted. That was one of my questions. And they said, "Oh yeah, it was at, that tea house down on the corner of Istiklal Caddesi." And I said, "Oh yeah, yeah." And they said, "Wow, we got into this big argument, and we're like fighting about it. And then this person said this, and this person said this, and suddenly, by the end of the night, 4 hours later, we had it figured out. This is who Jesus should be for the Turkish people. Jesus has got to be a God of justice, not just a God of love, because Turks are after justice." I mean, he went on. But I thought, sadly, this is not something he learned in any of the classes he took as a student, and probably never would. But out of that moment, and out of the moments other people described, one of my conclusions was that Turks learn best in agonistic situations. They love to argue. Very Turkish, to argue a truth until you arrive at some new iteration of it, and where everyone not agrees so much, but agrees that it's argued to the point where everyone's got something new out of it, right? Wow. And so, my proposal was like, all right, let's drink tea and argue instead of deliver lectures on 3 theological premises. And frankly, it's a lot more fun, I think, even for the teacher, not just for the Turks.
Well, and that brings it alive. That also embeds it in the space and the context.
But I think Westerners, though, that's sort of a great illustration. Westerners were assuming that what worked for them will work for the Turks in terms of educational style. And it wasn't until, I asked the questions that I understood what could work. I wouldn't have guessed that dynamic, right? But I had to be educated by the very people who were dealing with the issue itself before I could say anything coherent about something we might want to try.
I appreciate, again, the investment in the people, the respect for the place, and the uniqueness of what God might be doing there. And I think you have to have those 3 things: a sort of respect for the place that I hear loudly, and an eye for what God might be doing in a context. Very different. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to sit down with you. And your students talk about how valuable you are in terms of their learning and what they're able to see and make sense of and bring meaning to. And we appreciate you playing with us and hanging out with us and teaching us how to listen for narrative, which we do, but this is a different way of listening for narrative. Narrative that transforms, as you said, narrative that changes and alters, and that we might see something we hadn't seen before. So thank you.
Thank you.